The entire ballroom fell silent the second I crossed that threshold. Not the gradual hush of a room slowly noticing someone new. This was instant, like someone had cut a wire. 230 people, investors, executives, board members, journalists, employees who had spent years building something alongside a man they believed they knew, every single one of them turned to look at me. And standing at the center of it all, champagne glass raised mid-toast, face glowing with the kind of confidence that only comes from believing you've never been caught, was my husband. Beside him stood a woman. She wore a deep navy gown. Her hair was swept back perfectly. She carried herself like someone who had long since stopped wondering whether she belonged. Around her neck, catching the chandelier light in a way that made my chest tighten, was a diamond pendant I had received on my 25th wedding anniversary. A necklace that was supposed to be sitting inside a velvet box, in a locked drawer, inside the home I had shared with this man for 3 decades. The woman was smiling, right up until the moment she saw me. Then the color left her face so completely, she looked like a photograph that had been left out in the sun too long. My husband looked like he'd seen something that wasn't supposed to exist. From somewhere near the back of the room, a voice, hushed, confused, said, "Who is she?" I straightened my shoulders inside my army dress uniform. 32 years of military service had given me many things: discipline, patience, the ability to stay composed when everything around you is dissolving. I had used those skills in places most people will never see, in situations most people will never face. I had not expected to need them here. I looked at the woman first, then at my husband, then at the room full of people who deserved the truth. And I said 4 words that changed everything. "Hello, Richard." The silence deepened. "My name is Carol Mercer." I paused just long enough for the words to land. "The actual Mrs. Mercer." A champagne flute slipped from someone's fingers somewhere to my left and shattered across the marble floor. The sound was sharp and clean, like a period at the end of a very long sentence. And in that moment, the life my husband had been quietly constructing for years, brick by careful brick, lie by patient lie, began to come apart. But before I take you into that ballroom, I need to take you back. Back 3 weeks, to a Thursday morning, a plane touching down in Texas, and a surprise I had spent 11 months looking forward to. I want you to understand something about military life before I tell you the rest of this story. People who haven't lived it tend to romanticize it. The ceremonies, the uniforms, the sense of purpose. What they don't see is the other side. The missed birthdays. The phone calls that don't connect because of time zones and secure networks. The way you learn to hold grief at a distance because you cannot afford to feel it fully until the mission is done. The anniversaries you spend alone in a foreign country, marking the date in your mind because there's nothing else to mark it with. I was 58 years old, a colonel with 32 years of active service. Most women my age were planting vegetable gardens and visiting grandchildren. I was managing logistics operations for military personnel in conditions that were not comfortable and not safe and not forgiving of mistakes. I had loved every year of it, not because it was glamorous, it wasn't, but because I believed in something larger than myself, and I had been fortunate enough to spend my life in service to it. My husband Richard had always said he believed in that too. Whenever I came home apologizing for missed moments, he would wave it off. "You serve the country," he'd say, his hand on my shoulder. "I keep things running here. We're both doing what we're supposed to do." I believed him. I believed him for 30 years without ever seriously questioning it. Maybe that's the most painful part of all of this, not the betrayal itself, but the realization that I had been believing a performance instead of a person. The early return happened because my replacement arrived ahead of schedule. My commander offered me the leave immediately. I took it. I decided not to call Richard. The idea of walking through our front door unannounced felt almost nostalgic, old-fashioned in the best possible way. I imagined his face lighting up, the long embrace, maybe dinner somewhere quiet afterward. The simple things. The things you miss desperately when you've been away long enough. My flight landed in Dallas on a bright morning in early autumn. The heat came up off the tarmac like a greeting. I was wearing my dress uniform because I had an official ceremony to attend the following day, and I hadn't wanted to pack an extra bag. Instead of going home first, I decided to stop by Richard's company, Mercer Commercial. Partners had been built from the ground up over 2 decades. I had contributed in the early years, weekends spent doing bookkeeping while still on active duty, connections made through military channels that opened doors for his business, a second income that kept us stable during the lean years. The company was ours in the truest sense of that word, or so I believed. The headquarters occupied a glass-fronted building in a commercial district north of the city. I remember feeling something close to giddy as the rideshare pulled into the lot. Which is absurd, maybe, after 30 years together. But absence has a way of making ordinary things feel precious again. I walked through the front entrance and approached the security desk. The guard was young, mid-20s, pleasant face, the kind of easy friendliness that comes from not having encountered many hard things yet. He smiled as I approached. "Good morning, ma'am." "Morning," I said. "I'm here to surprise my husband." "Name?" "Carol Mercer." He typed something, looked up, "And you're here to see Richard Mercer." He nodded. Then, with the particular expression of someone who has just registered a harmless joke, he smiled a little wider. "And your relation to Mr. Mercer?" I laughed genuinely. "I'm his wife." What happened next is something I have replayed in my mind more times than I can count. The guard laughed, not cruelly, more the laugh of someone who thinks they've misheard something. Then he shook his head slowly. "Ma'am, Mr. Mercer's wife is already upstairs." I stared at him. "I'm sorry." He gestured toward the elevator bank. "She's in almost every day, usually comes in around 9. The room did not spin. I did not gasp or reach for a wall. 32 years of training had made me very good at receiving information without immediately reacting to it. But something cold moved through me, slow and certain, the way cold water moves when it finds its way through a crack. "That's interesting," I said. "There she is now, actually." I turned. A woman in her early 40s stepped out of the elevator lobby. Polished, confident, unhurried. She was the kind of woman who moved through spaces as though they had been arranged around her. Several employees glanced up and smiled as she passed. One held the door open for her. A woman at the reception desk lifted a hand in greeting. "Morning, Mrs. Mercer," someone said. "Mrs. Mercer." My name, my title, the name I had carried for 30 years. The woman smiled without breaking stride and walked toward the parking structure. Nobody hesitated. Nobody corrected themselves. Nobody seemed to register anything unusual about what had just happened. The guard turned back to me. His expression had shifted, not quite guilt, more the discomfort of someone who suspects they may have inadvertently created a problem. "I'm sorry about the mix-up," he said carefully. "Not at all," I replied. I walked back outside. I sat on a bench in the parking lot for nearly 20 minutes. This is the part people find hardest to believe, that I didn't march back inside, take the elevator to the executive floor, and demand an explanation. But military training does something specific to the way you process unexpected information. You don't react to the first thing you see. You gather. You observe. You verify before you act, because acting on incomplete information in a high-stakes situation is how people get hurt. I watched the black Mercedes pull out of the parking structure. I watched the woman drive away. Then I looked at my phone. Richard had texted me 2 days earlier. "Missing you, can't wait until you're home, love always." I looked at the building. I looked back at the message. Then I booked a room at a hotel 4 miles away and made the decision that would change everything. I was not going home, not yet, and I was not calling Richard. I was going to find out who that woman was. The first night in that hotel room, I did not sleep. I sat by the window with the Dallas skyline stretched out in front of me, and I thought with the methodical clarity that comes from years of making decisions under pressure. Affairs happen. I was not naive about that. Military marriages endure pressures that civilian relationships rarely face, and I had watched good people make terrible choices under the weight of loneliness and distance. I had always told myself that if something like that happened to us, I would handle it directly. Honestly, as adults. But what I had seen in that lobby was not an affair. Affairs are hidden. They are conducted in shadows, behind closed doors, with the constant low-level anxiety of someone who knows they are doing something wrong. The woman I had watched walk through that building was not conducting herself like a secret. She was conducting herself like someone who had been Mrs. Mercer for years. The employees greeted her the way you greet someone you are genuinely glad to see. The security desk listed her. She a Riv. Ed at 9 in the morning, like someone who had a schedule. Someone had wanted her to be seen. Over the next 3 days, I established a pattern. Civilian clothes, a coffee shop with sightlines to the building entrance, 4 hours each morning. I watched her arrive. I watched her leave. I watched Richard hold doors for her and walk beside her, and touch her arm in that comfortable, unconscious way that belongs to people who have been together long enough to stop thinking about it. On the 4th day, I found her social media. I wish I could describe the feeling of looking through 3 years of photographs, fundraisers, holiday parties, charity galas, business dinners, and seeing your husband standing in every single one of them beside another woman, both of them smiling the way people smile when they don't know they're being watched. Comments underneath each image. What a beautiful couple. You two are absolute goals. Mrs. Mercer looks gorgeous. I was not jealous. Jealousy requires uncertainty, and I was no longer uncertain about anything. What I felt was something far more specific. I felt erased, as though the 3 decades I had spent building a life alongside this man had been quietly written out of the official record. I called my oldest friend, Patricia. We'd met at a base in Georgia 26 years earlier, survived deployments and career pivots, and the kind of life events that either forge friendships into steel or dissolve them completely. She retired as a lieutenant colonel. She lived outside San Antonio. She answered on the second ring and knew from my voice alone that something was wrong. I told her everything. When I finished, there was a long pause. "You're absolutely sure," she said. "I wish I wasn't." Another pause, then, "Don't confront him." That was already my instinct. "Good," she said, "because you don't confront someone until you know everything, and right now you only know some things." She was right. She was always right about things like that. 2 days later, Patricia connected me with a former military investigator named Gerald Holt, retired, 70 years old, sharper than most people half his age. He listened to everything I told him without interrupting, and when I finished, he asked a single question. "Carol, do you believe this is just an affair?" I thought about it seriously. No. "Neither do I," he said. "And here's why. Affairs require concealment. What you're describing is the opposite of concealment. Someone wanted this woman visible." The word landed like a weight. Wanted. Not careless, not reckless, deliberate. Her name was Diane Holloway, 44 years old, former marketing consultant, previously divorced, no children. She had served on the advisory boards of at least 3 local charities that had also received substantial donations from Mercer commercial partners over the previous 2 years. The connections were not coincidental. Nothing about this, I was beginning to understand, was coincidental. Then came the phone call that broke something open inside me. An old neighbor named Susan had lived across the street from our house for nearly 14 years. We had been genuinely fond of each other, the kind of neighbors who feed each other's cats and bring soup when someone has a cold. We hadn't spoken in months, mostly because I had been overseas and the rhythms of ordinary life had drifted. She called me on a Tuesday afternoon, and after a few minutes of catching up, she asked a question that made my vision narrow. "So when did you move out, Carol?" I always meant to ask. I held the phone very still. "What do you mean?" "From the house, you and Richard." She sounded genuinely puzzled. "I figured you'd sold it or something. There's been another woman there. I assumed you'd moved." I kept my voice even. "How long has she been there, Susan?" The pause that followed lasted about 4 seconds. I counted them. "At least 2 years," she said. "Maybe longer." 2 years. Not 2 months. Not a recent arrangement. Not something that had developed while I was away on this particular deployment. 2 years. I closed my eyes. Sitting in that hotel room, I allowed myself exactly 3 minutes to feel what I was feeling. Then I folded it away, the way you fold a flag, carefully, precisely, with respect for what it represents, and I got back to work. That evening I drove past my own home. I parked across the street the way I had parked across from the office, and I watched. The porch light was on. The flower beds I had planted the spring before my last deployment were still there, tidy and well-maintained. The house looked exactly as I remembered it. And yet it didn't belong to me anymore. That much was clear. At 8:30, Richard's SUV turned into the driveway. A few minutes later, Diane came out through the front door. She kissed him, not with the self-consciousness of someone doing something forbidden, with the ease of someone who had done it 10,000 times before. Then they went inside together. I sat there for a long time. Not crying, not furious, just understanding. Sometimes the truth arrives all at once, in a single devastating moment. Sometimes it arrives in pieces, each one a little heavier than the last. For me, it was arriving in pieces, and each piece was changing me, not into someone broken, but into someone who had finally stopped being surprised. Back at the hotel, I spread everything I had across the bed. Notes, photographs, dates, names, connections. The picture was becoming clear, but something about it still didn't quite fit. Successful people don't risk everything they've built for a relationship, no matter how serious. Not without something else at stake, not without something to gain. The next morning, I called a family attorney named Helen Park. I had used her services once, years earlier, for an estate matter, and I had been impressed by her precision. When I described everything to her over the phone, she asked me to come in immediately. I sat across from her desk for 2 hours. When I finished laying out everything I had gathered, she folded her hands and looked at me steadily. "I think we need to look very carefully at the company's finances," she said. "Why specifically?" "Because people who are willing to sustain a lie this elaborate for this long," she said, "are almost never only lying about one thing." The forensic accountant Helen brought in was named Arthur Chen, quiet, meticulous, the kind of man who found more comfort in columns of numbers than in most conversations. He arrived for our first meeting carrying 4 thick folders. That alone told me something I did not want to know. He spread the documents across the conference table and spent the next 90 minutes walking me through a web of transactions that were, on their surface, unremarkable. Consulting fees, vendor contracts, property transfers, standard business activity for a company of Mercer Commercial Partners size. But when Arthur started connecting the threads, the picture that emerged was not standard at all. Money was moving, large amounts of it, and a significant portion of that movement traced back, through various channels, to Diane Holloway. "How much are we talking about potentially?" I asked. Arthur adjusted his glasses. "We're in the range of several $1,000,000, at minimum." The room felt colder. Several companies receiving payments from Mercer Commercial Partners had documented connections to Diane, one registered to a former business associate, one listing a family member's address, one with virtually no verifiable business activity but receiving regular monthly transfers regardless. None of this was accidental. These were not accounting errors or oversights. These were decisions, carefully made, deliberately concealed, sustained over years. What hurt most was not the money. At 58 years old, I understood that material things could be lost and recovered. What I could not recover, what nobody can recover, is the sensation of looking back across 30 years of a shared life and not knowing which parts were real. Helen called me later that week, with a discovery that sharpened everything into focus. Richard had recently begun restructuring the company's ownership percentages. The process was ongoing, not complete, but in motion. The projected timeline stretched across the next several months. "When were you originally due to return?" Helen asked. "About 3 weeks from now." There was a brief pause. "Carol, these transfers were scheduled to continue through the end of the year, based on the timeline." I understood before she finished the sentence. Richard thought he still had time. He believed I was overseas, on schedule, unaware. He had been in the middle of something unfinished when I walked unexpectedly through an airport door and drove to an office building and saw a woman wearing my name like a costume. He hadn't finished yet. That meant whatever he was building or dismantling was still incomplete. And that meant something important: we were ahead of him. An old employee of Richard's called me on a Friday afternoon. His name was Thomas Webb, 19 years with the company, started as a project coordinator, worked his way up to senior operations manager. I had always liked Thomas. Steady, principled, the kind of man who showed up early and stayed late not because he was trying to impress anyone, but because he believed the work mattered. He asked to meet for coffee. We chose a diner near the edge of the city, nothing memorable, just eggs and weak coffee and the kind of quiet that lets you say difficult things. After the small talk ran out, Thomas grew serious in the way people do when they've been carrying something and finally decide to set it down. "I almost didn't call," he said. "Why?" He stared at his cup. "Because I wasn't sure how much you already knew or how much you wanted to know." I told him to tell me everything. What Thomas described over the next hour was a quiet, systematic dismantling of the company's original culture. It had begun gradually, he said, a meeting that certain longtime employees were suddenly not invited to, a manager whose responsibilities were quietly redistributed, a trusted senior figure who found herself increasingly frozen out of decisions she had previously driven. The pattern repeated. Experienced people were edged toward the door. Those who questioned the new direction found themselves managed out. Those who accommodated it were rewarded. Over 18 months, the composition of the leadership team had shifted almost entirely. And at the center of it, directing, advising, influencing, was Diane Holloway. "Richard let it happen?" I asked. Thomas looked at his coffee. "Richard encouraged it." I absorbed that. Then Thomas said something that I still think about. He set down his cup and looked directly at me and said, quietly, "I probably shouldn't tell you this part." "Tell me anyway." He exhaled. Richard used to make a joke. When his name came up in conversation, if someone mentioned you or your career, he'd say, Thomas stopped. Started again. He'd say his wife loved the uniform more than she loved her marriage. I didn't speak for a long time. Not because I was shocked. I had prepared myself for a great many things over the past 2 weeks, but there is a specific kind of pain that comes from learning that someone you loved has been quietly rewriting the story of your life together, not in their private journal, but in front of other people, and that pain is different from other kinds. It is the pain of retroactive erasure, of discovering that the person who should have been your witness has instead been your revisionist. I had missed birthdays. I had missed anniversaries. I had missed dinners and holidays and ordinary Tuesdays that in retrospect I would have traded almost anything to have back. I had missed those things not because I was indifferent to my marriage, but because I believed, truly, deeply believed, that what I was doing mattered, and that my husband understood that, and that our partnership was strong enough to hold the weight of my absence. To learn that he had spent years using those absences as ammunition, as the punchline of a joke told to people who barely knew me, that was the thing that finally cracked something inside me. That night, I sat with a photograph I had carried overseas. Richard and I at my promotion ceremony, years earlier. He had his arm around my shoulders, and he was grinning with something that looked, in that moment, like genuine pride. I had looked at that photograph during hard nights and found comfort in it. I looked at it now, and I wasn't sure what I was seeing. The following week, Helen called. "We're ready," she said. I had known this moment was coming. We had spent 2 weeks building the case, financial records, corporate documents, witness accounts, photographs, timelines, everything organized, everything verified, everything ready to be presented to people whose understanding of the situation had, until now, been shaped entirely by Richard. "He still doesn't know you're here," Helen confirmed. "No." "Good, because that is our single most significant advantage." She was right. Richard believed I was thousands of miles away. He believed his version of events was the only version that existed. He believed the next several months would give him time to finish what he had started. He was about to discover how expensive that belief was. The invitation had gone out 3 days earlier, not to me, of course, but to the investors, board members, industry contacts, and local press who made up Richard's professional universe. He was hosting a company celebration to announce a major expansion initiative. The kind of event, specifically designed to generate goodwill and press coverage, and the particular glow that comes from standing in a beautiful room surrounded by people who admire you. When Helen showed me the invitation, I almost laughed. Richard had voluntarily assembled every single person whose opinion of him actually mattered, in one room, on one evening, at a time and location we knew about in advance. Sometimes people arrange their own reckoning without realizing it. The event was on a Friday, a luxury hotel in downtown Dallas. Ballroom capacity 300. Confirmed attendance included several major investors, the full board of directors, city council members, business journalists, and a significant portion of the regional leadership community. Exactly the right audience to hear the truth. The week leading up to it was strangely quiet. Not peaceful, I was not at peace. But I had passed through the worst of the grief in those early days at the hotel, and what remained was something more like clarity. Preparation had replaced panic. I knew what we were going to do. I knew how we were going to do it. I knew what the documents contained, and what they meant, and how to explain them to someone hearing about them for the first time. On Friday afternoon, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror in my hotel room and put on my army dress uniform. I had worn it at promotion ceremonies, at military funerals, at official functions on 4 continents. It had accompanied me through the full arc of a career I was genuinely proud of. What it represented, service, accountability, integrity, the willingness to sacrifice comfort for something larger than yourself, felt, in that moment, more relevant than it ever had. I smoothed the jacket, I adjusted the ribbons, I looked at my reflection. The woman looking back was older than the woman who had stepped off that plane 3 weeks ago. Not in years, in understanding. There is a version of heartbreak that diminishes you, that makes you feel smaller than you were before it happened. And then there is another version. The kind that peels away everything that was never really you in the first place, and leaves behind something harder and quieter and more completely itself. That was the woman in the mirror. Helen met me in the lobby. Briefcase in hand, expression composed, every document accounted for. "Ready?" she asked. I thought about it for a genuine moment. Yes. The ballroom was already alive with sound when we arrived. Laughter, music, the bright, generous noise of people who believe the evening is going to go exactly as planned. I paused outside the doors for just a moment. Part of me, not a small part, did not want to do this. 30 years is not nothing. Whatever Richard had become, whoever he had decided to be in my absence, there was still the person I had fallen in love with somewhere inside that history, and the life we had built had been real, or most of it had, and grief is complicated when the person you're grieving is still alive. But wishes do not change what is true, and what was true needed to be said. I stepped through the doors. The room did not notice me immediately. There was no dramatic moment of recognition, no sudden silence. I was simply another guest moving through a crowded ballroom. I walked steadily toward the front of the room, past tables of people mid-conversation, past servers with trays, past the easy abundance of an evening that had not yet been interrupted. Then the uniform registered. I watched it happen, a ripple of attention, heads turning, the particular confusion that comes from seeing something unexpected in a context where it doesn't belong. Several older employees looked at me with the expression of people who recognize something they cannot quite name. I kept walking. Richard was standing near the front of the room with a champagne glass held loosely in one hand. He was laughing at something someone had said. He looked comfortable. Happy, even. He looked like a man who had no reason to expect the next 30 seconds. Diane stood beside him. The diamond necklace caught the light. He saw me. I watched the laugh stop, watched the glass stop moving, watched the blood leave his face in a way that was almost cinematic, except that it was real and it was happening, and there was nothing performed about any of it. Diane noticed the change in him before she noticed me. She followed his gaze. And then she saw me, and whatever composure she had assembled for the evening dissolved in the span of about 3 seconds. The room was going quiet. Conversations trailing off, attention shifting, the collective instinct of 200 people that something significant was occurring. I stopped a few feet away, close enough to be heard clearly, far enough to maintain something that felt like dignity. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then I did. "Hello, Richard." His mouth moved. No sound came out. I had watched people freeze under extreme pressure before. This was not different, except that the person freezing was my husband, and the pressure was the truth. The whispered question came from somewhere in the crowd. "Who is she?" I looked around the room, at the board members, at the investors, at the employees who had shown up to celebrate a company they believed in, at all the people who deserved to know what had been happening. "My name is Carol Mercer," I said, clearly enough for the room to hear. "I've been married to Richard Mercer for 30 years. The reaction was immediate and visible. People stiffened, exchanged glances. A woman near the back of the room put her hand over her mouth. Board members looked at each other with the particular expression of people whose professional antennae have just registered something alarming. I looked at the necklace around Diane's neck. I'm also the woman to whom that necklace was given, on our 25th anniversary. Diane's hand went to her throat. Richard finally found his voice. "Carol," it came out barely above a whisper. "Tonight isn't about explanations," I said. My voice was steady. I had not raised it once. I was not going to. A board member, senior, silver-haired, the kind of man who has navigated crises before, approached carefully. "Mrs. Mercer, perhaps we should find somewhere private." "Ordinarily, I would agree," I said. "But what I'm about to share affects every person in this room who has a financial or professional stake in this company." He understood immediately. His expression shifted from discomfort to something more serious. Helen stepped forward. She opened her briefcase. She began distributing copies of the financial summary documents to the board members present, quietly, efficiently, without drama. The atmosphere in the room changed the moment people started reading. For the next 20 minutes, Helen presented the evidence, not with accusations or emotional language, with dates, with amounts, with documented connections between company funds and accounts traceable to Diane Holloway, with corporate filings that told a story very different from the one Richard had been telling. I did not speak again during the presentation. I did not need to. The documents spoke with the kind of authority that no personal testimony can match, because documents do not have motives. They simply exist. Board members asked questions. Helen answered them. Investors leaned in to compare notes. Someone quietly asked the hotel's coordinator to locate corporate counsel. The celebration had transformed, within the space of half an hour, into the beginning of an emergency proceeding. Richard stood at the front of the room through most of it. I watched him, not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with the particular sadness of seeing someone become unrecognizable in real time. Not because of what was being revealed about him. Because of what he had already done, long before tonight, in rooms I had never been able to enter. Before the evening ended, the board chair had announced that an independent investigation would begin the following week. External auditors would be engaged. All financial records would be made available. Nothing would be exempt from review. As the room began to empty, I found a quiet corner near a window and stood there for a moment, looking out at the city. I was not triumphant. I had not done this to feel triumphant. I had done it because the people in that room deserved to make decisions about their investments, about their professional affiliations, about the company they had trusted with accurate information. That was all. That had always been all. Justice, when it finally arrives, rarely feels the way we imagine it will. It is quieter, more complicated, tinged with a sadness for everything that had to break before it could come. The investigation took 12 weeks. I moved out of the hotel and into a small furnished apartment near a lake on the eastern edge of the city. Every morning, I sat on a narrow balcony with coffee and watched the water. It was a simple routine, and I held on to it carefully, because simple routines are what keep you anchored when the larger architecture of your life is being restructured. Within 2 weeks, the board suspended Richard from his executive position. The announcement appeared in local business news. Several investors issued cautious public statements. Business partners paused ongoing negotiations. Trust, once cracked, does not simply repair itself because someone wishes it would. Diane disappeared almost immediately. One week she was a fixture at charity luncheons, a name in the social columns, a presence. The next week she was simply gone. No public appearances. No social media updates. No company events. It was as though someone had carefully removed every trace of her, and the space where she had been closed over so completely that people stopped mentioning her name. Loyalty that is built on someone else's status is not really loyalty. It is convenience, wearing a more flattering costume. 3 months after the investigation began, the board reached its conclusions. Richard would no longer serve in a leadership capacity. His ownership interest in the company would be substantially reduced through a settlement arrangement. Additional legal proceedings would address the remaining financial questions. The company itself would survive, the employees, the clients, the legitimate work, but Richard's place within it would not. When Helen called with the final terms, I sat quietly for a long time. People expect you to feel victorious in moments like that. And maybe some people do. What I felt was tired. The particular exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has finally been allowed to set it down, and discovers, in the setting down, how much the carrying cost. The settlement provided me with financial security. That was enough. I had spent 3 decades living within my means and finding that my means were sufficient. Security mattered. Luxury at 58 did not. Patricia drove up from San Antonio the following weekend and insisted on dinner. Halfway through the meal, she raised her glass. To Carol Mercer. I laughed. What exactly are we celebrating? She looked at me for a moment before answering. You survived all of it without becoming bitter. I started to argue, then stopped. She was right. That was worth celebrating. It was the only thing in the end that truly was. Several months later, Richard sent me a message asking to meet. I thought about it for 3 days. Part of me wanted to refuse, not out of ongoing anger, but out of simple self-preservation. There are conversations that cost you things, and I was not sure I had anything left to spend. But avoidance, I had learned, is not the same as peace. It only delays the reckoning you are eventually going to have with yourself. We met at a quiet restaurant on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where the tables are spaced widely and nobody pays attention to strangers. When Richard walked in, I barely recognized him. Not physically, he looked essentially the same, but whatever composed the confidence he had always carried, the ease with which he had moved through the world, that was gone. What remained was something rawer, less finished. We sat across from each other, and for a while neither of us said anything. Thank you for coming, he said finally. You're welcome. More silence. I don't know where to start. Start with the truth. He nodded, took a breath. What followed was an hour that I had not expected. Not excuses, not the elaborate justifications I had braced myself for. Something closer to actual honesty, the difficult kind, the kind that implicates the speaker rather than defending them. He talked about feeling eclipsed, about watching a career he had built with his hands be described, in social situations, as something smaller than what his wife did, about a slow accumulation of resentment he had never found a way to voice, about choosing, year after year, the easier path, the one that didn't require him to examine himself. I convinced myself you had chosen the army over our marriage, he said. You knew that wasn't true. I know that now, he looked at the table. I think I knew it then too, it was easier to believe the other thing. I thought about what he was describing, not excusing it, but trying to understand it. Because understanding is not the same as forgiveness, and forgiveness is not the same as absolution, and none of those things require you to pretend the harm did not happen. Pain does not always produce wisdom. Sometimes it produces selfishness, a slow, entitled selfishness that masquerades as grievance, because grievance is easier to live with than responsibility. As we stood to leave, Richard looked at me with something I had not seen from him in years. Do you think you'll ever be able to forgive me? I looked at him carefully. I thought about what an honest answer required. I don't know yet, I said. And at that moment, it was the most truthful thing I had to offer. I retired from the United States Army on a warm afternoon in late spring. 32 years. When I first raised my right hand and repeated the oath at 26 years old, I could not have imagined the shape my life would take. I certainly could not have imagined retiring as a colonel. I could not have imagined, either, that I would be walking out of the final chapter of my military career while simultaneously rebuilding the rest of my life from the foundation up. But there I was, and the ceremony was beautiful. Patricia sat in the front row. Thomas was there. Helen attended. Former commanders, colleagues from different decades, people who had been part of different chapters, they gathered together in that auditorium, and I stood at the front of the room and looked at all of them and felt something I had not expected to feel. I had been focused for months on what I had lost: the marriage, the house, the particular future I had imagined and would not now have. I had been cataloging the losses. But standing there that afternoon, I saw what remained: friendship forged under real pressure, respect earned honestly, a community of people who had shown up without being asked, purpose that had never been contingent on anyone else's approval. Betrayal cannot take those things. It can try, it cannot succeed. A young captain approached me after the ceremony. She was nervous in the way that people are when they suspect they are talking to someone who knows something they don't. "Ma'am," she said, "what's the most important thing you've learned? From your career, from all of it?" I smiled. There were 100 possible answers, but only one felt right. Never build your entire identity around one person, I said, or one role, or one version of yourself that depends on someone else staying constant. Build it on things that belong to you. She nodded seriously. I hoped it landed. A few weeks after retiring, I began volunteering with a veterans transition organization. Former service members navigating the disorientation of civilian life, people who had spent years defined by mission and structure and belonging, and who now found themselves in a world that moved differently and valued different things. I understood those feelings better than I had anticipated. Every Wednesday, I met with veterans who needed help finding work, or housing, or sometimes simply someone willing to listen without needing them to be fine. The work was meaningful in a way that replenished something I had not realized was depleted. Helping other people with their rebuilding reminded me, constantly, that pain is not a terminus. It is often the last thing before something genuinely new. Nearly a year after returning home, a letter arrived. Handwritten, 3 pages, Richard's return address in the corner. I held it for a while before opening it. There were no excuses in those 3 pages. No requests. No attempts to relitigate anything or reframe the facts or appeal for a response he had not earned. Just honesty, the careful, late-arriving kind that comes from someone who has finally stopped defending themselves long enough to actually see what they did. He wrote about therapy, about learning to distinguish between what he had felt and what he had done with those feelings, and the distinction between those two things. About accountability, not as a concept but as a daily practice. About gratitude for the years that had been real, the ones that had been genuine, the life we had built before he decided to stop protecting it. When I finished reading, I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, not to forget it, to keep it. People often ask whether I forgave him. I did, eventually. But probably not for the reason people expect. I did not forgive Richard because he deserved it, or because what he did was understandable, or because time makes everything smaller. I forgave him because I had carried the weight of what he did for long enough to understand that it belonged to him, not to me. Anger is exhausting to maintain. Resentment occupies space that could be used for something else. At some point, I simply decided to put it down. Forgiveness is not a gift you give to someone who hurt you. It is a decision you make about your own future. It did not mean I forgot. It did not mean I trusted him. It did not mean we found our way back to each other. Some chapters are not meant to be continued. Some endings are final without being cruel. We met once more, months later. Coffee. An ordinary afternoon. We talked about mutual friends and health and small, neutral things. When the conversation reached its natural end, We parted with something that was not quite warmth but was not cold either. We wished each other well. Sometimes that is enough. Sometimes it is everything that remains, and everything that remains is enough. Today I am sitting outside at a community gathering hosted by the Veterans Organization, where I spend my Wednesdays. Children are running across the grass nearby. Old soldiers are telling stories that are at least partially true. The sun is beginning to lower itself toward the horizon, and the light is doing the thing it does in autumn, where everything turns a particular shade of gold that makes you want to pay attention. It is a good day. For a long time, I was not sure I would have days like this again. Not because of what Richard did, that was survivable, and I knew it, even in the worst moments. But because betrayal has a way of making you doubt the quality of your own perception, and when you can no longer trust what you see, the world becomes a more frightening place. What I have learned, on the other side of all of it, is this. The truth may not arrive when you need it. Justice may take longer than feels bearable. Healing may be slower and stranger and less linear than anyone told you it would be. But none of those things are permanent conditions. They are phases, they pass. The greatest revenge, and I use that word deliberately, because I know that is what people are looking for, was not standing in that ballroom. It was not the financial settlement, or the investigation, or watching Richard lose what he had spent years quietly dismantling. The greatest revenge was refusing to let what he did determine who I became afterward. Because when someone causes you real harm, there is always a choice. You can organize your life around the wound, carry it everywhere, let it define the room before you enter it, or you can keep moving, slowly, imperfectly, with more grace on some days than others, until the wound becomes a scar. And the scar becomes part of your story. Not the whole story, just part of it. If you have experienced betrayal and found a way through it, not around it, not over it, but genuinely through it, then you already know the thing I spent 3 weeks in a hotel room figuring out. That survival, done with dignity, is its own kind of victory. And so, at times the best years of your life are the ones that come after the worst thing that has ever happened to you. Thank you for listening.